so I can get out there look any way I want to. And that's been disarming at times because I'll have your money and gone for you.
She laughed it off. She said 4 words and the whole world exhaled. I ain't dead yet. Everybody believed her because that's what you do when Dolly Parton smiles at a camera and tells you not to worry. But her sister had already said something different, days earlier, in a quiet post that almost nobody paid much attention to at the time. And when you go back now and read that post next to everything that came after it, it doesn't read like an overreaction anymore. It reads like someone who already knew. For almost 60 years, Dolly Parton was the version of fame that never seemed to wear out. She was warm on television, funny in interviews, generous in real life, and somehow exactly the same person no matter which decade you caught her in. People didn't just enjoy her music. They trusted her, the way you trust a relative who always tells you the truth in the gentlest possible way she can find. So when something in her world started to look uncertain, most of us did what came naturally to us as fans. We waited for her to make a joke about it and then we let the joke be the whole story because that's the story we wanted. Her sisters didn't have that luxury. They weren't watching a public figure from a distance through a screen. They were watching their own sister up close, in the house they grew up sharing with 10 other brothers and sisters, in the months after she lost the person she had spent almost 6 decades of her life with. And what they saw, they eventually felt they had to say out loud, even knowing exactly how it would be received by a fan base that adored her and desperately wanted her to be fine. To understand why that mattered, you have to go back to March of 2025, to a man most fans only ever heard about and almost never saw. Carl Dean had been married to Dolly for close to 60 years, having met her on the very same day she first arrived in Nashville as a teenager. He avoided the spotlight completely for the entire length of their marriage. He never gave interviews, never appeared at her side on a red carpet, and somehow that absence became part of the story people loved about the two of them. Here was the most famous entertainer in the country, married for decades to a man almost nobody could pick out of a crowd, and the mystery of it only made people more curious and more fond of them both. Carl died in March 2025 at 82 years old, and Dolly, who rarely let anything slow her down publicly, was honest about what came next. She said plainly more than once in her own words, that she had spent years focused entirely on caring for him while he was ill, and that somewhere in the middle of that devotion she had stopped paying attention to her own health entirely. That admission is worth sitting with for a moment, because it isn't a small thing to say out loud. It's a woman in her late 70s telling the public that she had let something slide for the sake of someone she loved more than almost anything else in her life. And grief kept adding to it from there. Around that same stretch of years, the Parton family lost several of Dolly's brothers as well, one after another. When you're one of 12 children raised in a small house in the hills of East Tennessee, that kind of loss doesn't stay abstract or distant. It accumulates. It wears a family down in ways that don't always show up in headlines or interviews, but absolutely show up at the dinner table, in late-night phone calls, in the quiet moments nobody ever photographs. By the fall of 2025, that was the picture from inside the family, even if almost nobody outside of it could see it clearly yet. A woman who had just lost her husband of 6 decades. A woman who had buried multiple brothers in a short span of recent memory. A woman who had spent years as a full-time caregiver and openly admitted she had neglected her own body the entire time she was doing it. Her sisters weren't imagining a crisis out of nowhere. They were simply describing, as plainly as they knew how, what they saw whenever they looked at her. The first real signal to reach the public came in late September of 2025, when Dolly postponed her Las Vegas residency, citing health challenges. Coming from almost any other performer approaching 80 years old, that alone would have been treated as major, sobering news. Coming from Dolly Parton, a woman who had toured relentlessly for 6 decades and rarely canceled anything in her entire career, it was still notable, but it came and went fairly quietly in the news cycle, filed away as a scheduling issue rather than anything more serious. Then, in early October, her sister Frida posted a message online asking people to pray for her big sister. There was no diagnosis attached to it, no explanation of symptoms, nothing dramatic in the wording at all. Just a sister, quietly, asking for prayers the way people in that family had likely been doing their entire lives. For most families, a post like that would disappear into the ordinary churn of the internet within a day. But this was Dolly Parton's family, and within hours the message had been screenshotted, reposted, and rewritten into something far heavier than Frida had ever intended it to be. Headlines started to appear. Fans began writing tributes in comment sections before anyone had confirmed there was anything at all to write a tribute about. The word nobody wanted to say out loud was doing more damage in its absence than it would have done if someone had simply said it. Then Stella, another one of Dolly's sisters, posted as well, acknowledging the concern people had for her sister and pointing back to what Dolly herself had already said publicly about her health. It wasn't alarmist. It wasn't dramatic in tone. But it was a second sister, independently, publicly confirming that there was something real sitting behind the worry, not just an overblown reaction to nothing. And for a lot of fans watching from outside the family, that second acknowledgement landed harder than the first one had. One sister asking for prayers could still be read as an emotional moment shared a little too widely, a private feeling that slipped into public view by accident. Two sisters, speaking within days of each other, started to look like something closer to a pattern that the family itself was aware of. The response online grew large enough that Dolly addressed it herself, directly on camera. She recorded a short video from inside a studio during a commercial shoot for the Grand Ole Opry and posted it with the caption that would end up traveling around the world within an afternoon: "I ain't dead yet." She said the date out loud on camera so nobody could later claim the footage was old and being recycled to mislead people. She said she wanted to put everyone's minds at ease as quickly as she could. She acknowledged again that after Carl passed away she hadn't taken proper care of herself the way she should have. She described what she was dealing with as nothing major, said she'd canceled some of her commitments in order to stay close to home and focus on treatment, asked people to keep praying for her anyway, and then, true to form, she went right back to work as if nothing had happened at all. The relief among fans was immediate and enormous. The story flipped within a single news cycle, from genuine concern about Dolly's health to a kind of gentle teasing about how her sisters had worried everyone over what turned out to be nothing. Frida posted again the next day to soften her original message, explaining that she hadn't meant to alarm anyone or make things sound more serious than they actually were, and thanking everyone who had responded with prayers and kind words. And that, for most people watching from the outside, is largely where the story settled. A misunderstanding. An overprotective family. A star who was fine and who was funny about being fine, and who had proven it live on camera for everyone to see. Except the story didn't actually stop there. It just went quiet for a while, the way these things often do. In January 2026, Dolly turned 80 years old, and the state of Tennessee marked the occasion with an official proclamation honoring her music, her decades of philanthropy, and her lifelong connection to the state that raised her. It was a genuine, well-earned celebration, filled with tributes from people across the country. It was also, looking back on it now, the kind of tribute that tends to arrive when a great many people quietly sense, even without saying it directly to one another, that a long and remarkable story might be entering its final chapter. In March 2026, Dolly made her first in-person public appearance of the year, opening a new season at Dollywood, the theme park she helped build in the mountains where she grew up. She looked and sounded like herself up on that stage, cracking jokes with the crowd the way she always had, but she also told them plainly that she hadn't been touring, that grief over losing Carl had worn her down more than she had expected it to, and that she had a few health issues that she and her doctors were actively working on together. She spoke about focusing on healing. At one point she even joked with the audience that they shouldn't mistake the park's president standing beside her for a new boyfriend, making it clear with her usual humor that she wasn't seeing anyone new in her life. Every part of that appearance was reassuring on the surface, and every part of it also contained a quiet admission sitting just underneath the reassurance, if you were listening closely enough to catch it. Then came May 2026, when Dolly canceled her Las Vegas residency entirely, the same run of shows that had already been pushed back once before. She explained the decision herself, again in another video message to her fans, saying she had struggled with kidney stones for a number of years, that her immune system and her digestive system had both been out of balance for a stretch of time, and that her doctors were working hard to help her rebuild and strengthen both. She said she hoped to be back to normal, or as she put it, up to snuff, again soon. She mentioned that she was still developing a Broadway project in the background, because stopping completely was never really something Dolly Parton knew how to do, even when her body was asking her to slow down. Through the months that followed, Dolly continued giving updates in her own voice, always in that same familiar tone, direct but light, honest but never quite alarming enough to make people truly worry. In August 2026, only days before the end, she told fans she had been through a genuinely hard stretch health-wise, repeating what she had said before, that she hadn't paid enough attention to her own condition while she had been so focused on caring for Carl during his final years. She said she was healing. She said she was still working. And for anyone watching closely, that phrase, still working, was the one that made it easy to believe there would be more time ahead of her. On Tuesday, August 25, 2026, Dolly Parton died at her home in Nashville. She was 80 years old. Her family said she died peacefully, surrounded by loved ones, and her publicist later confirmed that she had been facing a brief battle with cancer. The news wasn't broken by a press release from a record label or a network. It came from her nephew, Brian Seaver, who had served as her head of security for more than 20 years, a role his own father had held before him in the family. He said Dolly had asked him, years earlier, to record the message that would eventually announce her death, long before he was ever able to accept that it was something he would actually have to do one day. He described the moment as an honor mixed with pride and sadness, and said the sadness belonged entirely to the people left behind, not to Dolly herself. The family statement described her as a rhinestone life that shone bright enough for the world to see, and said she would always be remembered not just for her music and her songwriting, but for the wit and warmth that made so many people feel like family, even people who had never met her. The family asked for privacy around a small service, and asked that instead of flowers, people consider donating to Dolly Parton's Imagination Library, the program she built that has put hundreds of millions of free books into the hands of children all around the world. And somewhere in all of that, there's Stella and there's Frida, the two sisters who said something back in October of 2025 that a lot of people brushed off at the time as an overreaction. They weren't spreading a rumor. They weren't exaggerating for attention, and honestly, attention was never something either of them particularly needed from a story about their own sister's declining health. They were simply telling the world what they were seeing up close, from inside a family that had just lost a husband of 60 years, lost several brothers within a short span of time, and was watching someone they loved deeply try to carry all of that weight while insisting to everyone, including maybe herself, that she was fine. Looking back at that entire timeline now, laid out from beginning to end, it reads very differently than it did in the moment it was actually happening. Last October, two sisters said they were worried about their sister's health. It seemed like too much at the time, an overreaction to ordinary aging and ordinary grief, and then Dolly made a joke about it that was genuinely wonderful, and it gave everyone permission to relax and move on. The sisters got gently teased online for causing a scare over what looked at the time like nothing. But they weren't wrong to say what they said. They were simply early. That's really the whole story here when you strip away everything else. Not a scandal, not a secret being deliberately kept from anyone, just the ordinary and painful truth that the people closest to someone usually sense what's coming before the rest of the world is ready to hear it, and often long before the rest of the world is willing to believe it. For 6 decades, most of us knew Dolly Parton as the woman who never seemed to slow down, never seemed to run out of warmth, and never seemed to stop finding new ways to give something back to a world that had given her so much fame in return. Her sisters knew a slightly different version of her these last 2 years, a version most fans never really got to see up close. They knew a woman who had just lost the person she'd spent her whole adult life with, who had buried more than one brother in a painfully short span of time, who had poured everything she had left into taking care of somebody else, and who quietly stopped taking care of herself somewhere in the middle of it. They tried, gently and without any fanfare, to tell the rest of us that. Most of us heard the joke instead because the joke was easier to carry, and because nobody really wants to believe the version of the story where the person who always seems fine might not actually be fine underneath it all. Were you following Dolly Parton's story over this past year? Did any of these moments stand out to you at the time, or does the whole timeline only really make sense now looking back on it? Share your thoughts and your own memories of her in the comments below, and if you'd like to see more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed for what's coming next.